The reason the message of the Prophet continues to resonate to this day is its timelessness and eternal relevance. Indeed, for us, the Prophet existed as the messenger for all eternity, beyond our conception of time. And yet, he also existed as a person on this earth, and for those who lived during his time, he represented an enigma, an extraordinary person. Of course, once he announced himself as the messenger, his contemporaries had a reason to explain his behavior and personality. But what about before revelations? What sort of life did the Prophet live? And what sort of society and culture was his mission revealed in? What was the world like at that time? It was a world without TV and the internet, without planes and cars, with different forms of governance and different dominant powers.
Yes, you had, for example, the Persian Empire, and you had the Roman Empire. These are alluded to, they're mentioned in the Quran, and we also know of people who became companions of the Prophet, Sahabas, who were from these parts of the world, Suhaib Suhaib, and also Salman al-Farsi. These people, these are the ones we know of, the famous ones, but there were many others, not as famous as these ones. They brought with them the ideas of the Persians. This is clearly evident, particularly in the traditions or hadith that speak of the battles that Salman and others tried to introduce the use of Persian weapons during the battlefield. The Persian bow, and bow and arrow, and then the Prophet adopted this for some time, and then he felt he couldn't use it because he was not familiar with it. So then he said, "I'm resorting to the Arab bow and arrow because that's what I'm familiar with." So these cultures were being introduced, and some of them were being adopted by the Arabs, and some were not being adopted. People came into Makkah. Some were captured, for example, during some of the intertribal wars, and some were captured and then they would settle. Some came simply, as travelers, or some on adventures, and some, came on trade and then decided to settle. And so there were many reasons why people found themselves in that region. Some came from as far as Abyssinia, from Africa. Some were captured as slaves. Some were sold as slaves. So you had, and all these people were there. And we are also talking about the influence. One of the influences that is often not mentioned is the influence that the Abyssinian Empire itself had on Arabia. We know that even in pre-Islamic Arabia, that when there was a dispute between the Banu Hashim and Banu Umayyah over the administration of the Kaaba, sometimes they would often send delegates to the Abyssinian king, the Najashi or Negus, to arbitrate between them, because he was seen as someone they could trust and someone who was of the same status as the Arabs, that they could tend to arbitrate between them. There were these examples.
In this world, ancient Arabia was not exactly a dominant hub, but it wasn't isolated either. The antique relevance and glory of the Kaaba meant that Arabia, and particularly Mecca, was a crossroads for many travelers and civilizations.
Arabia, around that period, was in contact with the other neighboring countries and cultures. It was not closed off from the other dominant cultures of that time. And we see this clearly reflected in some passages of the Quran, which refer to Rome, Ghulibat Rome, verses which refer to the Persian empires. So the Arabs also, because the main sources of revenue were trade, particularly for the Meccans, trade and pilgrimage. The people were coming to perform Hajj. It meant that they were exposed to people who were traveling from the neighboring states, Yemen and so other Arab tribes, who considered the Kaaba a holy sanctuary, because the sanctity of the Kaaba is not something that Islam introduced. Even before Islam, the Kaaba was already believed to be a sanctified place by Arabs. So they came from all over to perform pilgrimage. They brought with them their cultures, and they also brought with them merchandise to trade during the period of Hajj. And Arabs also traveled to Syria, they traveled as far as Africa, Abyssinia, they traveled to Yemen and other parts of the world. So they were exposed to what was going on around them. And the term Arabia is very general. It includes a number of countries, but I think the area you're referring to is the region of the Hijaz, Makkah, Medina, and that part of the world, where the religion of Islam emerged from and where the Prophet lived. Now, in the case of Makkah, Makkah was a cosmopolitan city for two reasons. First, because of the pilgrimage, the season of pilgrimage, it attracted a lot of people from different parts of the neighboring Arab societies and communities, and also because of trade as a center of the Arabian Peninsula. It meant that traders would often stop at Makkah to pay homage to the gods in the Kaaba, and also to water their camels and so forth, and then to trade, and then they would carry on wherever they were going to. So that meant you found people from different cultures in Makkah. Makkans were exposed to wide range of ideas and cultures. Medina, on the contrary, was a bit more conservative. Medinians, it was an agricultural city. It depended a lot on agriculture. So the Medinites were not as exposed to what was going on, in other parts of, even of the Arab world at that time, as the Makkans were. And that is why you find that in the Quran, when we read that and as well as in the traditions of the Prophet, that when the Makkans migrated to Medina, there were initially some cultural tensions, if you like, particularly in matters relating to sexual relations. The Makkans, when they got married to Medinites, the Makkans were always experimenting, if you like, with different forms of sexual expression, whereas the Medinites found, as a conservative Arab community, the Medinites found it very, very difficult, and they would come to the Prophet and ask the Prophet, is it allowed for me to engage in this particular sexual act, or is it allowed for me to do this with my wife or my husband, because my husband or my wife, who is from Mecca, is asking me to do this and that. And that's when you read all those traditions from the Prophet, where he would give license to certain acts. Well, it's allowed, as long as you don't do this. It's allowed for you to do this as long as you don't do that. And all these traditions, as well as the verse in the Quran that your women are like your teeth and fatu, and that verse that they are like a teeth, you may approach, however, whenever you like. According to interpreters of the Quran, they were revealed in response to some of these questions, which were coming about as a result of intercultural cross-pollination.
One of the central tenets of ancient Arabia was the religion of idol worship. In fact, it was a system similar to present-day society's obsession with celebrity idols, in the sense that instead of one defined religion, everyone had different idols to worship. And this idol worship was integral to both the city of Makkah's and the Kaaba's importance.
The idols were mostly tribal idols. Each tribe had an idol, or many idols. In some cases, each family, would have an idol which they would, if they had influence, they would place in the Kaaba, and their families would come and pay homage to this particular idol and other idols in the Kaaba. The institution of idol was both, you could say, religious and political, and it was spread through many ways, poetry being one of the ways. Poetry was the dominant form of cultural expression in pre-Islamic Arabia. Every young man growing up would have learned some verses of poetry from the pre-Islamic period, or would have been exposed to them. It was part of the education, of any young man at that time. And the idols were important in this sense that they gave the tribe a kind of a sense of common identity, something they would, rally around. But they were not organized religious, rituals. It is very difficult for us to say in any grade of detail, or even with confidence, that we know exactly what role or function these idols played. First, because we do not have much information from the pre-Islamic period. Most of what we know from the pre-Islamic period comes to us through poetry and through fragments of what we call Ayamul Arab. These were narrations about the battles that the Arabs fought. And we also know from the Quran, which is the earliest document alongside the poetry. So the Quran is not a historical text in the sense that it doesn't give, when I say it's not a historical text, I mean it's not a textbook on history. It is a historical text in the sense that it was revealed within a certain historical period, but it's not a textbook on history. You cannot read the Quran and expect to learn much about what was going on in Arabian society. It might give you some clues which you can then read against, say, the poet of that time and against other various forms of historical material. So what we know for certain is that idols were prevalent and they were an important aspect of pre-Islamic life for a majority of the pre-Islamic Arabs of that time. They played, as I said, both a political, you could also add an economical function because they were housed in the Kaaba. This meant that when other Arabs would come from various parts of the world to pay homage, they brought with them revenues, which would become very useful for the Quraysh Arab tribes. The Quraysh benefited in a way, in the sense that the prevalence of the idols, rather the practice of worshipping idols, gave them both political power and prestige among other Arabs. As the custodians of the Kaaba, it meant that they had the keys to the Kaaba. They would also provide water to those who came for pilgrimage. This gave them a kind of social status, as well as political status. But it also brought with it a lot of wealth for the custodians of the Kaaba, for the Meccans, because people coming in, they were not only praying, they were also bringing, a lot of gold and other forms of wealth to donate to the Kaaba or to trade. And this is one of the reasons why, although the Meccans, if you look even in the Quran, it suggests that they believed in God, in Allah, as the supreme being, and yet they went on to oppose the message that Muhammad brought. If you ask them who created the heavens and the earth, they will say it is God. It meant that the Quraysh Arabs believed in God, and yet they rejected the message. They rejected the message because it would threaten their political power as well as their economical power, the influence and prestige they enjoyed in pre-Islamic Arabia. Because if you removed the idols, that would mean that people, they thought that once the idols had been removed, people would no longer come to do pilgrimage. They would boycott the Hajj, and this would undermine their position. And this is why they were strongly opposed to the message of Tawheed or of monotheism, because it was seen as threatening to their power as well as their money.
Unlike our world of central government, state institutions, and legal codes, the entire Arab system was based instead on a loose confederacy of various tribes, all existing within a similar set of values.
In pre-Islamic society, Meccan society was based mostly, there were two dominant tribes in Mecca at that time. You had the Banu Umayyah, and then you had the Banu Hashim, and then you had also within these various tribes, you also had different clans, if you like. But the main tribe, if you like, in Mecca was the Quraysh tribe, which was divided between into these two main families, the Banu Umayyah and the Banu Hashim, and there were other clans as well. It was a tribal society in the sense that everything revolved around the tribe. Your allegiance was first and foremost to your family and your tribe. It was also a society based on certain values, very rigid values, muru'ah, or manhood, if it's a manliness, muru'ah, generosity, hospitality, hamasa, and all these values which became central themes in pre-Islamic Arabic poetry, or the qasida. And you also had families that became very prominent because of what they did. For example, the Banu Hashim, because they were the custodians of the Kaaba, they enjoyed very respectable position in the eyes of other Arabs, not just the Meccan, but other Arabs as well. And there was also competition between the Banu Umayyah and the Banu Hashim. This competition is reflected, you see this mostly in the poetry that was produced. The various tribal poets would poke fun at the enemy tribe or at the other tribe. And you also had competition between the tribes to produce the best poet. If the Banu Umayyah this year produced the best poet, next year it will be the Banu Hashim trying to produce the best poet. The best poets were judged by a group of very respected experts in poetry, and the best poem would be suspended on the Kaaba. That is where we get the term the mu'allaqat poem, the suspended poems. Although there are differences among historians now whether they were actually suspended on the Kaaba or if simply they were recited at the Kaaba and then you'd be given an award. So having your poem being suspended on the Kaaba or recited at that place at the Kaaba was, you could say, the equivalent of a Nobel Prize in literature. So this was a very, very, that was the highest honor any poet could get. So the tribe that managed to produce that kind of poet was seen by other tribes as a very, very...
In our day and age, it's quite impossible to imagine a world without the written word. All our records, transactions, and information is largely stored in the written form. But the defining feature of Arab society and the means of both cultural transmission as well as cultural record keeping was poetry. Even though language as a written form existed and was used, poetry was what served as the primary means of disseminating knowledge and values.
The centers like Mecca were also centers of culture. The most important cultural event of the year was the Souk Uqaf, the Uqad market, if you like, which attracted poets, tribal poets from various parts of the region who would come and showcase their talent. They would recite their talent. It was also an agricultural fair, a kind of trade fair, and you also had poets coming and competing with each other, and from this souk, if you like, the market, you had the development of new world meaning, or rather the transmission of meanings, because words and meaning were transmitted through a chain of transmission, the same way that hadith came to be transmitted. So it was from this fair that you later on you would hear someone saying that, well, this particular word in Arabic means this because that is how it was recited by so and so. I met him at the souk and he told me this was the meaning of the word, and this very often these meanings will be transmitted from the Bedouin tribes. So the pre-Islamic poem, we often refer to it as the qasida. It is it kind of formulaic, but it's not really that much of a formula, if you like. They were set to a meter, a rhythm, and they dealt with the specific themes, and it could be the theme of love. Most of the poems, about love, lost love. You had a part of the poem that would be lamenting lost love, and there would be a part of the same poem speaking of the adventures of the poem. The tribes he fought and killed on his path to look for his lost love. You also had a part of the poem that the hijab that would be attacking the enemy tribes, poking fun at the other tribe. You also had other poems that would be praising, maybe a tribe and so forth and so on. And they dealt with a wide range of themes, but there were other poets who also went against the grain, who did poetry that was different from what everyone was familiar with. There were others who would do poetry that discussed completely different things. In oral tribal societies like Arabia, where the transmission of education was mostly orally, although there were people who could write, but there were not many people who could write. You actually paid people to write on your behalf if you were wealthy, and you spent a lot of time memorizing poetry and other, important legends of Arabia that were important as part of your education, although you couldn't write these down. Mm-hmm. And these were people who could memorize the genealogies of their camels, and the genealogies of their families. So this camel belongs to so and so. They'll give you, trace back the genealogy of a camel, back centuries. So that was part of the important aspect of the education that any young man needed in order to train the skills of the retentive skills to memorize, the ability, as I say, the ability to speak good Fusha Arabic, proper Arabic, which was seen as superior and very different from the Arabic that they were speaking in the cities. And this is the Arabic that we also see reflected in the Quran. Although the Quran, alludes to other forms of Arabic, but in the dominant, language is this very high Arabic of that time.
Mm-hmm. So this was the society that the Prophet was born into. From the beginning, his life was marked by events which were perhaps not extraordinary, but certainly marked him as different.
The orphans would have had, a difficult life in Arabian society as they would in any other society. But the difference being that being a tribal society, you always had other people around you, coming to take over of the, as we see clearly, it clearly happened with the Prophet after his parents passed away, someone stepped in, after the grandfather passed away, someone stepped in. So there was always someone stepping in. So once someone stepped in, you were no longer considered, an orphan in that sense, because you had people to look after you. So his experience would not have been very different from any other young man who had parents. He would have missed his parents, of course, but he would not have been treated. The experience would have been different, but he would not have been treated differently. He would have had a different experience, obviously, as someone who does not have both parents, with him. But he would not have been looked at in any way different, because you were not looked at as an individual. You were looked at as a part of a community. So any form of disrespect shown to you was a disrespect to the tribe as a whole, and that would create all kinds of problems. So people would be very careful on how they treated each other. It was mostly dependent on who your family, who your families were, and what your tribe, what tribe you belonged to, what family you belonged to. And if people wanted to look down upon that family, they would look down upon any child from that family, regardless of whether that child had parents or not. So your identity as an individual was there, but you also was part of this, community, which had to be respected, either because they deserved the respect or because people were afraid of offending them, because they knew of the consequences of that.
Much like our children go away to universities to be educated, the Prophet, in accordance with Arab custom, was sent to the villages to learn the authentic way of Arab life. Unlike our times, though, he was sent at a very young age and was taught not just new forms of knowledge, but new forms of experience as well.
The Bedouin tribes were also sent as considered to be the sources, if you like, of Arabic meaning. And this is precisely why you also find that when interpreters of the Quran later on wanted to identify meanings of certain words, they would often say, well, this is how the Bedouins understood this word, so we think this is how it means in this verse in the Quran. The Bedouin life was seen as sort of stable and still in touch with the roots, with the cultural traditions of the tribe and of what became later known as Al-Arabiya, Arabism. So yes, and the city was seen as a place that is, where things are fluid, because of the various influences that, your identity may not be authentic. So if you want to be an authentic Arab, so you'd have to send your children to the Bedouin villages where they would experience authentic Arab life. Not this custom. The Arabs mostly sent those the children were still young before they reached what is known as bulugh, when they sort of matured. Could be any age, teenagers. Before they reached that, this could be when they were still young, 6 years old, 5 years, 8 or so, and they would spend months in these villages. How often it depended on the families. Though some could afford to send maybe 3 times, twice, or before the young, before the boy becomes a baligh or mature. And it was not a matter of just dropping them and then coming as we do these days. You jump in the car and you go drop. They had to travel to these villages, and it was also dangerous. So that's why they would take time to plan this, and when they leave the children there, and then the children have to stay for some months there in order to acquire all the knowledge and experience that that the family wanted their children to acquire. This may seem strange to us today, that why would parents send their children away, and at that stage of their life when you want to be attached to your children, and you want them to be in the house, and to be present with you, and to watch them as they mess up things and so forth and so on. It was part of that culture, and this was an essential part of, you could call it, the primary education. So the parents were doing this because they didn't love their children. They were doing it because they cared for their children. And children who didn't have this experience, they sort of became outcast in society, not because of anything, because they didn't have the education that you'd expect from a reasonably educated young Arab. Mm-hmm. So a reasonably educated young Arab, the definition of education then was not the letters, that you had to know the alphabets and how to write, and it was this was the education. So anyone who would have gone through this form of education was considered an educated person, a literate. To times today we call them literate men, but because we are defining education through this narrow, vision of education as the ability to write. So a young man like Muhammad, we know that he was sent to spend life in the villages, where he would have been taught about the lives of the great poets of the pre-Islamic era. That was part of the curriculum. We don't know if Muhammad was actually taught the poetry, but he was not immune to the cultural, activities of that time. We know that he make references to some verses of poetry. He would be taught to hunt. He would be taught to fight, because it was a period in which every young man had to be taught to fight. In case you had to defend your tribe. He would be taught how to be a good role model, if you like, to be a good young man. He would be taught how to speak, because the ability to speak was very, very important for the Arabs. Although he would have grown up in an Arabic-speaking environment, but they valued Bedouin Arabic more than Arabic from the cities like Mecca, where he was born. So he would be seen by other village kids as the boy from the city, who has just arrived from the city with the new things from the town, with the new toys. So they would be taking him around, showing him some very strange animals they eat, and we know this from the traditions of the Prophet, that he saw some very strange things. For example, certain tribes would eat certain lizards of some sort, and he said, "No, we don't eat that in the city. we don't eat that." So he was exposed to all this very wonderful, and it must have been very exciting for him as a young man, coming from what was an exciting city, Mecca, exposed to people from all parts of the world, but coming to the Bedouin life, of hunting, of eating organic food, so to speak, and going to help and contributing to the life of the family that is taking care of him, and so forth and so on. And from the records we have, which became part of hadith later on, these families had nothing but good, they only said good about the experiences with him. They say
These days, the world is being rocked by protests led by young people, mainly graduates, who are faced with dwindling employment and opportunities. When the Prophet graduated, he too was faced with a bleak and difficult future.
He didn't have many choices because uh, at this stage we know that his grandfather passed away, and the family is also depleting. You know, the family was not wealthy. His family, they had social capital, you know, in the sense that they were respected, but they were not a wealthy family. You know, although they did trade, so he did not come from a wealthy family. He came from, you know, a family that were surviving and managing. I did say that they were highly regarded. People may think that they were highly regarded because they were wealthy. No, you know, he was not wealthy, and his family, his uncle and grandfather, they were not wealthy. They were struggling to look after him. You know, this is very clear from, you know, from the sources we have, that they were finding it difficult. They were not complaining because it was their duty, but, you know, looking after him and others around was not cheap, and they were having financial problems. And we know that he did a lot of jobs. He worked for people, you know, and you know.
What sort of job?
Well, he would work as a, you know, as a trader here. Did something there. We don't know the nature of work. We only know that he worked for this Jewish, you know, businessman, or he worked for this person, he worked for that person. We have those records, what he was doing, whether it was farming, whether it was what, we don't have the details. We know that he worked for Khadija as a trader. You know, he must have acquired that experience from somewhere. So we assume that all the other work he was doing before that was trade.
And yet, even though there was nothing remarkable about his fortunes or his prospects, the young Muhammad was an enigmatic figure. Even through the little we know of him from this time, we can learn of his value and place within his society.
He was always known, I mean, from reliable historical accounts, he was always known for doing things that you did not expect a normal young boy to do. I mean, he was known for arbitrating between warring tribes. You know, one of the famous, you know, incidents is when tribes had been fighting, you know, over who was going to place a rock on the Kaaba, you know, a certain rock on the Kaaba, and he came with an idea that, you know, well, a member of each tribe should hold, you know, on the corners of a cloth, they should put that rock, you know, the black stone in the middle, and then they lift it up there, and he would place it, you know, in its right place. So he was always involved somehow, and people trusted him, even as a young man, before he was married. So he was involved. He could call a kind of activist of some sort, you know, a social activist. He was trying to help out in many ways. Now, what we know about his life are the major events. You know, we know that he approached, or he came up with an idea to resolve the conflict about, you know, the building of the Kaaba, you know, the reconstruction of the Kaaba, not the building of the Kaaba, but the repair work that was going at the Kaaba. Now, why would a young boy just come up with that idea unless if he had built a kind of reputation? So it means that he had been doing other things that, you know, that he elevated his status in the eyes of the elders of the tribe.
As some sort of an intellectual, an activist, as a good role model.
He was a good role model. People, the elders of the tribes, felt that, look, if we don't give this young man a voice and we don't listen to his advice, what message are we sending to the other young people out there? He had built that reputation on the back of the things that he was doing, the small things that we don't know of, because they are not recorded. We only know of the major events that are reported. So on the basis of the major events, we are able to safely suggest that it is because he had built this reputation by doing many other things, because we know the society. It is not a society where young people just turn up and tell elders what to do, especially, you know, very powerful tribes. In order to do that, it meant that you had, you know, acquired some kind of status, you know, in his own right as an individual, not because he was married to Khadija, a very powerful lady.